Hello there. This is All 24 News special coverage on the Russia-Ukraine file with me, Karim Zachary, coming to you live from Algiers. Here's what's on tap today. Russian military advances in eastern Ukraine this month have raised growing concern in the West that the balance of the war is tipping in Moscow's favor. But Biden's administration officials think these fears are overblown and that Ukrainian defenses remain solid in this ugly war of attrition. Ukrainian officials have argued that they need more heavy weapons fast to hold the line against the Russian offensive in Luhansk and Donetsk provinces in the east. To talk more about these developments and other pressing issues, I am joined live via Skype by Professor Yiğit Suraya, a professor of politics and international relations at New Vision University from Georgia. And from Italy, joining us live is Emmanuel Macron, a geopolitical analyst. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. A short break and we kick off the discussion. So the latest updates on the Russia-Ukraine file revolve around what's happening at the forum in St. Petersburg. Vladimir Putin said Moscow does not oppose the membership of Ukraine in the European Union. The Russian president added that the economic sanctions against Russia had no chance of succeeding from the very beginning. So before we follow this report, let's commence with you, Mr. Suraya Yiğit. The economic sanctions are increasingly being used to promote the full range of American foreign policy and the West's objectives. Yet, all too often, sanctions turn out to be little more than expressions of US and West preferences that hurt their own economic interest, without changing the target's behavior for the better. Don't you think that, as a rule, sanctions need to be less unilateral and more focused on the problem at hand? The West need to institute far more rigorous oversight of sanctions, both prior to adopting them and regularly thereafter, to ensure that the expected benefits outweigh likely costs and that sanctions accomplish more than alternative foreign policy tools. So how far was Putin's statement on the sanctions at hand true?
Thank you very much for the question. Generally, of course, sanctions have had a mixed response, whereby the intended effects have not always been realized. Now, with regard to the sanctions that are put onto the Russian Federation, they are unprecedented, and they are having some effects. Of course, the Russian president is saying that these are, if I'm not mistaken, he said these were crazy or ineffective and the like. But more importantly, of course, is we're looking at the sanctions in a different time scale. Sanctions require time to be effective, to have impact. One cannot expect sanctions to have an immediate impact. These are not short-term answers to a problem. Certainly, they're more than symbolic because they're trying to create extra costs for the aggressor, for the actions that they have taken. So in that respect, I think one has to be a little bit more patient with regard to sanctions. Now, if you recall, sanctions also came in different packages. So it was step by step. So it was almost, as it were, a tit for tat. So if you continue doing X, then you'll be facing the consequences of Y. So sanctions haven't stopped at the moment. In fact, if you look at the recent declarations by the Ukrainian foreign minister, he is asking for a complete energy sanction, an embargo, an energy embargo on Russia. And also he's putting forward the case that there should be an international maritime shipping embargo on Russia as well. So this is an ongoing process. One has to be more patient to see the results of sanctions.
For more on what Vladimir Putin said on the sanctions, let's follow this report and then we get back to more discussion.
Unlike Ukraine's bid to join NATO, Russia's president is not opposed to the membership of Kiev in the European Union, but such a step would make from Ukraine a semi-colony for the West. In his 73-minute speech at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, Vladimir Putin affirmed once again that his enemy is the Western military alliance and not the EU. The Russian president has a version of seeing things, a version far from the Western one, which says that Moscow's special military operation in Ukraine will spark a global food crisis. On the contrary, for the Russian leader, his country has been making efforts such as meeting African leaders in order for people in some parts of the world not to suffer from famine. 4 months ago, Russia started sending troops in Ukraine. Since then, Moscow came under an array of Western sanctions. But according to Mr. Putin, these economic arrows aiming to paralyze Russia's economy are double-edged sword affecting countries beyond Russia, including those of the European Union. The knock-on effects for the conflict in Ukraine are being blamed on Moscow. Moscow, meanwhile, says there are other reasons for this, and that its special military operation in Ukraine was inevitable, given the current circumstances Russia is currently facing in the region.
So let me welcome Mr. Emmanuel Pietrobon, who just joined us. Mr. Emmanuel Pietrobon, all too often the economic, humanitarian and foreign policy costs of US and Western sanctions far outweigh any benefits. What then could and should be done in this case of Ukraine?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation.
Welcome, the pleasure
about the sanctions and what else could be done. We can do a lot actually, because the world, and is not my opinion, and as Putin said during the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, is now entering a new phase, and this is the phase of multipolarity. So what we can do, what we could do actually, is to strengthen the sanctions regime against Russia. And the European Union is actually divided. There are two schools of thought. There is a party led by the Poland and the former communist states, which would like to have a more impacting sanctions regime. And then there is a secondary school of thought about sanctions, which is led by the European Union most powerful countries, which are France, Germany, and Italy. And these countries don't want to sanctions Russia a lot, and they don't even want actually to send advanced weapons to Ukraine, because they would like to have peace as soon as possible. Mm-hmm. So we could do a lot actually, because the European Union was, is, and still will be for a while Russia's main trading partner. But until the European Union is divided, only a little can actually be done. And the US can do a lot, because the US has not with Russia the same kind of economic, trading and financial relationships which the European Union has. So this is the main problem of the West. It is divided.
Mm-hmm. But this division is not groundless, Mr. Emmanuel Pietrobon. I mean, because Europe is heavily reliant on Russia, as you just stated, on the one hand, and concerning the heavy weapons, perhaps the fear of perhaps entering into an, let's say, a large-scale war with Russia is the main reason.
You know, in politics, geography matters, and it does matter a lot. Indeed, we have countries like mine, Italy, which are mostly diffident, if not indifferent, about the conflict. And then you have countries like the Baltics, Finland, Poland, Romania, which are playing a key role in this conflict. They are trying to encourage the European Union to send more weapons, to implement more sanctions. Why? Because of geography. Those European countries which are closer to Russia, they fear to be the next targets of the Kremlin. This is why they are trying to stop Russia in Ukraine. But for Italians, for Spanish, for Portuguese people, we have no concern about a possible Russian invasion.
Thank you for that statement. Indeed, Professor Ayed Soraya, we see that there are some European countries that, as Emmanuel Pietrobon just stated, are indifferent, and which is quite the opposite of what the West was expecting, and the US as well, because there are a lot of countries that are indifferent regarding what's happening in Ukraine, and some of them think that perhaps it is something legitimate that Russia is doing because the West and the US actually have been ignoring Russian interests for a while. What's your statement about that?
I actually disagree with that, because if you look at the response that the West has given after February 24th, this was quite unexpected, to be perfectly honest. Initiated by the Europeans, that came as a bit of a surprise. Close collaboration with the United States, and a really united front has been put forward on this war that's taking place in Ukraine. Now, I think there's a couple of important points to bear in mind here. Number one, there was close collaboration between the Europeans and the Americans with regard to their sanctions packages, which we discussed a little bit earlier. But more importantly, of course, there's been the delivery of defensive weapons that are being sent to the Ukraine. There's been an enormous amount of declaratory support. And most importantly, we saw something quite significant yesterday with the European Union declaring that the Ukrainians would be eligible for candidate status. This was something that Ukraine had been demanding and asking and hoping for quite some time. And yesterday this was achieved. So in that respect, I do think there's widespread Western support.
It seems that the support is more symbolic than it is really effective, don't you think, Mr. Soraya?
Certainly the Ukrainians believe so, because the Ukrainians are demanding more weapons. They're asking for more heavy artillery, tanks, anti-ship missiles, multiple rocket launchers, combat aircraft. The list goes on and on. NATO, of course, from the very outset has declared that first, there will be no air cover, and secondly, there will be no boots on the ground, as it were. So it's unable to go beyond that in terms of NATO capacities. But of course, individual countries have been providing weapons systems to Ukraine. It is a delicate situation whereby Ukraine wants a lot more than what the Western allies are willing at this stage to be able to transport and give. So
indeed,
in a way...
Actually, Ukrainian officials are intensifying the request for Western help, while their forces see death tolls climb and weapons dwindle. And Ukraine will be waiting to see what decision comes out of NATO, sending the heavy weapons. Not only is going to provoke Russia, but at the same time, it will take time for the weapons to be delivered, as you just mentioned. If they arrive safely, that is, without Russia targeting them, meaning logistically, it's going to take time. And concerning training Ukrainian soldiers is also going to take time. And the fear of the Western technology falling in the wrong hands is also very likely. How do you analyze all this, Mr. Ayed Soraya?
Again, yesterday, I think your viewers are probably quite aware that Boris Johnson visited Kiev, and he put forward the case that 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers would be trained every 4 months and be eligible to enter into combat. So that's, of course, a very positive step taken by the UK, of course, not an EU member, but a very important NATO member. That's good, but it's insufficient. Because the Ukrainians and the British agree on several aspects of this war in Ukraine. First, they agree that it's an existential war for the Ukrainians. The British Foreign Secretary has openly stated that Putin must be defeated. In fact, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov underlined this fact and actually challenged Boris Johnson and the Foreign Secretary Liz Truss to implement this. Furthermore, there's agreement not just between the UK but with other Western countries on the whole that a compromise now would actually embolden Putin and it might even run the risk of expanding the war. So there's all of these things going on. But in a very wider perspective, if we want to take that approach, there is an agreement that a Russian victory would ipso facto mean a defeat for liberal values and norms. And that's very important. And furthermore, there's an additional factor added to that, which is that there is a Russian fear of a demonstration effect. And what do we mean by this? If Ukraine is stable, democratic, liberal, and becoming wealthy, and as we said, on the path towards European Union membership, that's going to have a demonstration effect on the Russian population at large. Russians themselves are going to be asking questions. If the Ukrainians can do this, why shouldn't we?
And it seems all under the threat of nuclear weapons and nuclear war. And here, let me address Mr. Emmanuel Macron concerning the decline in nuclear weapon stockpiles. It seems that it has seen perhaps a probably coming to an end, meaning we have seen before a decline in the nuclear stockpiles, but now there is going to be a decline. We see an end to that. An international arms research group said in a new report that war in Ukraine was a factor to intensifying going to, let's say, having armament, nuclear armament. How do you read this issue, Mr. Emmanuel? And what threat does this pose to a global order?
Well, I think it's a natural consequence of the Ukraine war, a new arms race. And, this arms race is, in fact, not new. There was an ongoing arms race long before the Ukraine war. But what other powers have seen right now, they are seeing, is that nuclear weapons are a kind of protective shield against possible foreign incursions, foreign attacks against you. The world witnessed the power of nuclear weapons in the case of North Korea. When Kim Jong-un managed to build a nuclear arsenal, suddenly he protected his regime from a scenario of regime change, and new diplomatic talks with the US started. So in the case of the Ukraine war, the world is witnessing the West trying to defeat Russia by means of a proxy war, but fearful of a direct warfare against Russia. Why? Because a direct war against Russia would mean a nuclear war. And so other powers might be willing to build new nuclear arsenals in order to be protected as well.
And perhaps I would paraphrase the question to Mr. Professor Yit Soraya concerning the nuclear weapon stockpiles that has seen a decline since the Cold War. We see, or we witness in that it is coming to an end as more and more countries are trying to build nuclear weapons. How do you read this threat to global order?
This is not a new phenomenon. The Nuclear Proliferation Treaty has been around for decades, and successes were noted. And I think it's good that we remind ourselves that when the Soviet Union collapsed, was dissolved, the Soviet nuclear arsenal was basically centered in three constituent republics. One was the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic, basically Russia. The other one was Ukraine, and the other one was Kazakhstan. And in actual fact, at the time, there were press reports saying that for the first time, an independent Islamic or Muslim country has nuclear weapons, given the fact that it was located on Kazakh soil. But very quickly, the Ukrainians and the Kazakhs declared that they had no interest in possessing nuclear weapons, and these were returned, as it were, to Russia. So in terms of proliferation, there has been incidences of success. There have been cases of progress. Obviously, there are a couple of schools of thought with regard to this. There's one school of thought that believes that the more nuclear weapons, the more stable the world is. And there's another which puts forward the case for nuclear proliferation, saying that it's not a good idea for nuclear weapons to be in the hands of many, many states. This is not a stable balance of power. So that's sort of an academic debate that's been going on for decades and decades. But with regard to proliferation, it's in the interest of all of those great powers or nuclear states, as it were, for this club to be quite limited. None of them would prefer or do prefer for this club to get enlarged.
And since Mr. Ayit Soraya, you mentioned EU bid or Ukraine's EU bid, let me share with you this info so we can discuss more. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Friday welcomed the European Union's move to put his country on a path to membership. The European Commission recommended that Ukraine should be granted EU candidate status, a first step on the long road toward EU membership for the war-torn country. Zelensky said he spoke with European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and European Council President Charles Michel earlier in the day to coordinate the next steps. It also recommended that the EU Council meeting next week grants Moldova candidate status as well, on the understanding that the country will carry out a number of further important reforms.
The Commission recommends to the Council, first, that Ukraine is given European perspective, and second, that Ukraine is given candidate status. This is, of course, on the understanding that the country will carry out a number of further important reforms.
I spoke today with Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission. I thanked her and all members of the European Commission for their leadership and today's decision. I also spoke with European Council President Charles Michel. We are coordinating our steps, and I am grateful to Charles for feeling the historic significance of these processes for both Ukraine and the future of Europe. Today, I will also speak with the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, Mark Rutte. I use every opportunity of our interests for Ukraine.
So I get back to you, Professor Ayit Soraya, since you mentioned EU membership, Ukraine's EU membership. What benefit is there for Ukraine to join the EU, knowing that its record of corruption is really high and it does not really meet the Copenhagen criteria to join the EU? That's on the one hand. And what's it for the EU bloc to let such a war-torn country, to join the bloc? Is it going to be heavy, economically speaking, for the bloc?
Yes, let me take those in reverse order, if I may. First of all, of course, it will be a heavy, heavy burden, as you say, for the European Union to accept Ukraine as a member state. But having said that, let's put this again into perspective. Number one, this is not going to take place overnight. I think it's important to clarify that there's many, many steps to go ahead. First of all, next week, the EU Council is going to meet, and you require unanimity for this candidate status to be given to Ukraine. But it's also important to remember that candidate status is, of course, symbolic. It's important. One isn't denying that. But candidate status doesn't automatically start negotiations. You can use a metaphor, for example, of a starting gun. But there's no guarantee that the racer is going to reach the finish line and win a medal. So candidate status is not important in itself. And von der Leyen has underlined that fact by saying that it will be merit-based. She actually insisted that it would be merit-based. And you're right, there are tremendous challenges facing Ukraine, not just Ukraine, of course. Moldova was mentioned and Georgia was mentioned yesterday as well. And here, of course, one needs to look at the main areas where there are deficiencies in Ukraine. You mentioned corruption. Transparency International, which investigates corruption worldwide, lists Ukraine at near the very, very bottom in terms of corruption. The European Union itself has called into attention the difficulties with regard to the rule of law in Ukraine. And it's also underlined the fact that there should be a modernization of the judiciary. So there are some extremely important hurdles to overcome. But let's also remember that this is an unprecedented step by the European Union. The European Union, for the first time in its existence, is actually offering candidate status to a country which is fighting a war, which is under occupation, and which regards it as an existential war. So that's one thing. And just to wrap up, as a comparison, becoming candidate status really doesn't mean a lot. And I want to sort of underline this fact with regard to the relationship the European Union has had with Turkey. Now, Turkey had an association agreement, or started negotiating an association agreement in the late 1950s. 35 years ago, it applied for membership of the European Union, European Union then. 23 years ago, it achieved candidate status, and it's been negotiating for 17 years. Because to enter the European Union, you must undergo negotiations on what's called 35 different issue areas, 35 chapters. And once you've cleared one chapter and all the European Union member states agree, then you go on to the next. So it's a very, very, very long process.
And Mr. Soraya, I mean, during the economic forum, St. Petersburg Economic Forum, Vladimir Putin did mention the fact that Ukraine is free to join the EU bloc if it chooses to, but it will be a semi-colony. What do you think he means by that?
Because the understanding is, of course, that there is this Western conspiracy to encircle and contain Russia, and that Ukraine will be a part of this bloc. But you are right in underlining the fact that Putin did say that he had no objections to the European Union. Why? Because the emphasis of the European Union is on economic affairs. It's an economic union. But he's drawing a very different line when it comes to security cooperation, when it comes to NATO. Because NATO, of course, is a security-based organization, and he's very much against that. But this is acceptable. And in all respect, I think that should be taken positively, and that should be seen as a progress with regard to how these issues will be delved into in the future.
And Mr. Emmanuel Pietrobon, do you think that Ukraine should become a member of the EU, and why, according to you?
Yes, in my opinion, Ukraine should enter the European Union, but it's a self-defeat for the European Union not to grant a fast track to Ukraine. I mean, we are in the middle of an emergency, in the middle of a war, and the European Union keeps being a bureaucratic entity, which is not willing to grant a fast track to Ukraine, nor is willing to give it to Moldova or to Georgia. On the contrary, we informally withdrew from the South Caucasus by not giving a recommendation on European Union membership to Georgia. This is actually a victory for Russia, because Russia for years have been pressuring the West to exit the Caucasus, and we did so yesterday, actually. So, in my opinion, Ukraine brings with it a lot of challenges and a lot of opportunities, because yes, it is a war-torn country, but there is also a business called reconstruction. The challenges come from the frozen conflicts within Ukraine and within Moldova, and also from the possible discontent coming from those countries, like my colleague said, like Turkey, which for years have been waiting to enter the European Union, and right now are witnessing to the open of talks to other countries like Ukraine and Moldova, and such countries like Turkey, Albania, and North Macedonia may actually push the European Union to have themselves also a way to enter the European Union quicker.
Professor Ayit Soraya, as a last question, how do you see an end to this crisis? Do you think that a peace deal means Ukraine will lose the occupied territories for good?
I wish I had a crystal ball and I could tell you the future. Unfortunately, I don't. But one thing that one can say is that any ceasefire is better than the continuation of war. So we hark back to the famous quote by Churchill, "Jaw is better than war." But in order for any peace settlement to be long-term, there's going to have to be compromises on both sides, number one. At the moment, it looks highly unlikely that Russia is willing to make any compromise. And that's precisely what the Ukrainians are putting forward. Their strategy is assist us in gaining more territory, more regaining captured land, as it were, so that we have a far more stronger hand in the negotiating table so that we can compromise and reach, hopefully, a fair and just settlement. But in order to do that, they need to push the Russians back, because you're dealing with a very bad hand at the diplomatic negotiation table if 35-40% perhaps of your country is already occupied. So in that respect, unfortunately, I do not see this war coming to a close in the short term.
Thank you so much, Mr. Souraid. We have reached the end of our special coverage. Thank you, dear guests, for your thorough analysis, and thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News with me, Karim Fazakari. That's the end. Bye for now.